"Did you like the lake house I gave you, Mom?" my son asked, his voice warm, almost proud, as if he had just reminded me of a beautiful memory we shared. And for a moment I thought I had misheard him, because nothing in my life, not in the past 2 years, not in the quiet routine of my days, resembled anything close to owning a lake house. So I looked up from the pumpkin pie I had just set down on the table and said the only truth I knew. "What house, David?" And the words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have, stretching across the dining room like something fragile about to snap. And that was when I noticed her, Victoria, standing just behind him, her smile still perfectly in place, but her eyes shifting, calculating, as if she was already searching for a way out of a conversation that hadn't even begun yet. And something inside my chest tightened. Not panic, not yet, just a quiet, creeping awareness that something wasn't right, that something had never been right. "And I'm glad you're here. I want you to stay with me through this, because I didn't understand it in that moment either. I only knew that Thanksgiving dinner, the one I had spent 3 days preparing for, suddenly felt different, like the room itself had changed, like the walls had pulled back just enough to reveal something hidden behind them. And I stood there at the edge of the table, my hands still lightly dusted with flour, trying to make sense of what my son had just said, because I hadn't received any house. I hadn't received anything at all, not the past due notices I'd been juggling, not the prescription I'd been stretching to last an extra week, not the worn coat I had been wearing through 2 cold winters. None of it fit with the picture he was painting. And yet he was looking at me with genuine confusion now, his brow slightly furrowed, like a businessman faced with numbers that didn't add up. And I realized then that whatever this was, it wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It wasn't a forgotten gift or a misplaced document. It was something deeper, something that had been happening quietly, just out of reach, for longer than I cared to admit. And when David took a step closer and said, slower this time, "The lake house on Morrison Lake. Mom, I transferred it to you 2 years ago." I felt the ground beneath me shift in a way that had nothing to do with age or balance, because 2 years ago was exactly when things had started getting harder for me, when every dollar began to matter, when every small expense became a decision. And suddenly those 2 timelines, his generosity and my struggle, collided in a way that made no sense at all. And I could hear the faint sound of Victoria's heels moving across the hardwood floor behind him, retreating toward the kitchen, quick, controlled, almost silent, but not silent enough, not anymore. And I didn't turn to look at her, not yet, because I was still looking at my son, still trying to understand how a life I had been living so carefully, so frugally, could exist alongside a version of reality where I had been given something so significant, so life-changing, without ever knowing it. And that was the moment, standing there between the table I had set with my best dishes and the truth that was beginning to surface, when I realized I wasn't just confused. I was about to find out something that would change the way I saw my own family forever. I did not answer him right away, because the truth was I did not trust my voice to sound steady if I spoke too quickly, and instead I moved slowly back to my chair and sat down, folding my hands in my lap the way I used to when I needed to think before reacting, because something about the way this conversation was unfolding told me that rushing would only make me miss something important. And David remained standing across from me, still holding his phone as if the answers might already be there waiting for him, while the kitchen behind him had gone strangely quiet. No sound of cabinets, no running water, just the kind of silence that feels intentional. And I finally said, very carefully, "David, I have never received any house. And if you sent me money, I never received that either." And I watched the change happen in his face, not anger, not yet, but confusion sharpening into something more focused, something colder, the way he used to look when he was solving a problem at work. And he shook his head slightly as if correcting a mistake in his own thoughts and said, "That is not possible, Mom. I have been sending you $1,500 every month for the past 2 years." And the number settled into the room with a weight I could almost feel pressing against my chest, because $1,500 a month was not a small detail. It was not something that could simply disappear. It was enough to change everything, enough to mean I would not have had to count every dollar at the grocery store, enough that I would not have stood in the pharmacy last winter deciding which medication I could afford to refill and which one I would have to wait on. And I felt my fingers tighten slightly against each other, but I kept my expression still, because now I understood that whatever had been happening, It had been happening consistently, methodically, and without my knowledge. And David was already scrolling through his phone, his movements quick and precise, opening emails, pulling up records, his breathing just a little faster than before, and I could see it clearly now, the shift from son to businessman, from casual conversation to investigation, and I did not interrupt him because I needed to see how far he would go on his own, needed him to arrive at the truth without me pushing him there. And after a few seconds that felt much longer than they should have, he turned the screen toward me, his voice lower now, more controlled. "These are the transfers, Mom. Every month, same amount, same account." And I leaned forward just enough to see the numbers, the dates, the confirmations, all of it neat and orderly in a way that made my own reality feel suddenly disorganized and incomplete, because I knew those numbers had never touched my life, not once, and I sat back again slowly, letting that realization settle fully, because there was no longer any room for doubt, no simple explanation that could smooth this over. And from the corner of my eye, I noticed a slight movement in the hallway leading to the kitchen, just enough to tell me that Victoria was still there, listening, waiting, and I did not look at her not yet, because this moment was not about confrontation, it was about clarity, and I said quietly, more to myself than to anyone else, "Then it went somewhere." And the words did not sound emotional or dramatic, they sounded calm, almost detached, but inside I could feel something shifting into place, like pieces of a puzzle finally aligning after being scattered for far too long. And for the first time that evening, I was no longer trying to understand what was happening, I was beginning to understand who had made it happen. I did not raise my voice, and I did not ask another question right away because there was no need to. The answer was already forming in the silence around us. And David must have felt it too, because he did not sit down again. He stayed standing there with his phone still in his hand, staring at the screen as if it might suddenly change and give him a different explanation, but it did not, and I could see the tension building in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened just slightly, the way his breathing became more measured, more controlled, and that was when he turned his head slowly toward the hallway, toward the place where Victoria had disappeared, and he called her name once, not loudly, just enough for it to carry, "Victoria." And for a moment there was no response, just that same heavy quiet that had settled over the house. And then I heard her footsteps again, slower this time, more deliberate, as she walked back into the dining room with that same composed expression she always wore in public, the one that suggested everything was under control even when it clearly was not. And she stopped just a few feet away from us, close enough to be part of the conversation, but not close enough to feel trapped in it. And I noticed how she did not look at me first. She looked at David, measuring him, reading him, trying to understand what he knew and what he did not. And David did not waste time with pleasantries. He simply turned the phone toward her the same way he had shown it to me and said, very evenly, "Can you explain this?" And there was no accusation in his tone yet, just expectation, but it was the kind of expectation that demanded a clear answer. And Victoria glanced at the screen for only a second before looking away, which told me more than any words could have, and she let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but it did not sound natural, it sounded practiced, and she said, "It must be some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe the bank made an error or something got redirected." And I watched her closely as she spoke, not her words but her hands, the way her fingers twisted lightly around each other, the way she avoided holding eye contact for more than a second at a time. And I realized that she was not searching for the truth. She was searching for a version of the truth that would hold together just long enough to get her out of this moment. And David did not respond immediately, which surprised me, because I expected him to challenge her right away, but instead he studied her in silence, the same way he would study a contract or a report that did not quite make sense, and I could see it happening in real time, the pieces connecting, the pattern becoming clearer, and I felt something settle inside me as I watched them, something calm and steady, because for the first time I was not the only one seeing it. And after a few seconds David spoke again, quieter now, but far more direct. "The transfers were set up by my assistant, but you helped coordinate everything back then, did you not?" And there it was, not a question anymore, but a statement that narrowed the space she had to move, and Victoria hesitated just long enough to confirm what we already knew. And in that brief pause I understood something important. This had not been a single mistake or an isolated incident. This had been deliberate, repeated, and carefully managed over time, and I felt no urge to interrupt, no need to defend myself or demand justice in that moment, because the truth was already doing that for me, unfolding slowly and unmistakably right in front of us. And as I sat there with my hands still folded in my lap, I realized that the life I had been living for the past 2 years, the one filled with quiet sacrifices and careful choices, had not been shaped by circumstance alone. It had been shaped by someone else's decisions, someone else's actions, and now that those actions were coming into the light, there was no way to push them back into the shadows again. I did not speak after that because there was nothing left to clarify, only something left to confirm, and I could see that Victoria understood that as well, because her posture shifted just slightly, not enough for anyone who did not know her to notice, but enough for me to see the tension tightening beneath the surface, and she finally met David's eyes, holding his gaze a second longer than before, as if deciding whether to continue the story she had started or abandon it entirely, and then she chose carefully, her voice softer now, more controlled. I helped organize some of the paperwork, yes, but I did not handle the actual transfers. That was your assistant's responsibility. And the way she said it was almost convincing. Almost, if not for the small delay before she answered, if not for the way her shoulders lifted slightly as she spoke, as if bracing for impact, and David did not react immediately, which told me he was not listening to her words anymore. He was measuring them, comparing them against what he already knew. And I realized then that this was no longer about me explaining my situation. It was about him uncovering the truth on his own terms. And that gave me a strange sense of calm, because for the first time I was not alone in this realization, and as I sat there quietly, I found my mind drifting back, not in a dramatic way, not with sharp flashes of memory, but with a slow and steady awareness of the past 2 years, the small decisions I had made every single day, the way I had stretched groceries to last an extra few days, the way I had turned off the heat earlier in the evening to save on the electric bill, the way I had folded the same winter coat over my shoulders each morning even when the lining had begun to thin, and I remembered standing in the pharmacy just a few months ago, holding 2 prescriptions in my hand and calculating which one I could afford to fill that week and which one could wait, and I had told myself at the time that this was just how things were now, that this was part of getting older, part of living alone, part of adjusting to a quieter life after my husband passed, and I had accepted it without question, because I did not want to burden my son, because I believed he had his own life to manage, his own responsibilities, and now, sitting at that table, I understood that while I had been adjusting, someone else had been deciding where the money went, deciding what I would and would not have, deciding how much I would struggle, without ever asking me. And the realization did not come with anger the way I expected it might. It came with a kind of clarity that was almost unsettling, because it meant that every difficulty I had faced was not simply the result of circumstance. It had been shaped, guided, and maintained. And when I looked up again, I saw that David had taken a step closer to Victoria, not aggressively, but with a purpose that had not been there before. And he said her name again, quieter this time but far more serious. Victoria, where did the money go? And there was no confusion left in his voice now, no uncertainty, just a direct question that could not be softened or redirected. And Victoria hesitated again, but this time the pause was longer, heavier, and in that silence I realized something else, something just as important as the truth itself. She had not expected this moment to come. She had not expected the question to be asked this clearly, and as I watched her struggle to respond, I felt something shift inside me once more, not into anger, not into sadness, but into a steady, quiet understanding that whatever happened next, whatever explanation she attempted to give, would not change what had already been revealed. And for the first time in a long while, I was no longer trying to hold everything together. I was simply watching it come apart on its own. Victoria did not answer right away, and that silence told me more than anything she could have said, because it was no longer the silence of someone thinking, but the silence of someone calculating. And I watched as she drew in a slow breath, her shoulders rising slightly before she let it out again, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost too calm, the kind of calm that is carefully built. I handled some of the logistics back then. David, you were busy, remember, and your assistant asked me to help coordinate things. Maybe there was a mix-up with the account information, and she said it smoothly, almost convincingly, but it did not reach her eyes, and David did not nod, did not accept it. He just stood there looking at her, as if he was waiting for something more, something real, and when she did not offer it, he spoke again, more firmly this time. There is no mix-up. The transfers went to the same account every month. I need to know whose account that is. And I felt the shift in the room then, subtle but undeniable, because this was no longer a conversation that could be redirected, and Victoria's composure slipped just slightly, just enough for me to see the tension in her jaw, the way her lips pressed together before she answered again, slower now. I would have to check the records. I do not remember the exact details from 2 years ago, and I knew then that she was buying time, not to find the truth, but to decide how much of it she could reveal without losing everything. And I sat there quietly, my hands still resting in my lap, feeling none of the urgency that filled the space between them, because for me the truth had already settled into place. It was no longer a question of if something had been taken. It was a question of how long it had been happening and how carefully it had been hidden. And as they stood there facing each other, I found my thoughts drifting again, not to the big moments, but to the small ones, the quiet ones that had seemed insignificant at the time, like the day Victoria had offered to help me organize my mail after my husband passed, insisting that it would be easier if she handled the paperwork for a while, or the time she had gently suggested that online banking was too complicated and that she could take care of things for me. And I had trusted her because she was family, because I believed that trust was something you did not question within your own home. And now those memories felt different, not warm or comforting but precise, like pieces of a pattern I had not seen before, and I realized how easily trust can be used, not loudly, not forcefully, but quietly, over time, until it becomes invisible. And David finally broke the silence again, his voice lower now, but far more controlled. Victoria, I am not asking you to check anything later. I am asking you now, where did the money go? And there was no room left for explanation in his tone, no space for delay, and Victoria looked at him, really looked at him this time. And for the first time that evening I saw something different in her expression, not confidence, not control, but the beginning of realization, the realization that the story she had been managing so carefully was no longer hers to control. And in that moment, I felt something settle inside me once more, not anger, not satisfaction, just a quiet certainty that whatever came next would not be hidden. Because once the truth begins to surface, it does not stop halfway. It continues until there is nothing left to conceal. And I remained where I was, silent and still, not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood now that I did not need to say anything at all. Victoria's lips parted as if she was about to answer, but no words came out at first, and that hesitation stretched just long enough to confirm what none of us wanted to say out loud. And I watched as she lowered her gaze briefly before lifting it again, this time with a different kind of expression, not composed, not controlled, but searching, as if she was trying to find a version of the truth that could still protect her. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, stripped of its earlier confidence. I was trying to manage things, David. You were overwhelmed back then. Your mother was still adjusting. I thought it would be easier if I handled everything. And she paused, as if waiting for that explanation to settle, as if hoping it would be enough. But David did not respond. He did not move. He simply stood there looking at her with a stillness that felt heavier than anger, and she continued. More quickly now. The account was temporary. I meant to sort it out. I just needed time. And I felt a small shift inside me as she said those words, not because they explained anything, but because they revealed something else entirely. This had not been a momentary lapse or a single poor decision. It had been something sustained, something maintained over time under the careful cover of intention, and David's voice when he spoke again was lower, more deliberate. 2 years is not temporary. And the simplicity of that sentence seemed to land harder than anything else he could have said, and Victoria's composure broke just slightly at that, her shoulders dropping, her hands no longer still but moving in small, uncertain gestures as she tried to hold on to her explanation. I was going to tell you. I just needed to make sure everything was stable first. And I realized then that she was no longer explaining what had happened. She was explaining what she had told herself about what had happened. And there was a difference, a quiet but important difference, because one was built on facts and the other on justification, and I sat there listening to it unfold, feeling none of the urgency that filled the room, because the truth had already taken shape in my mind, and it was not complicated. It did not require interpretation. It was simple and direct. Money had been sent, and I had not received it. And the person who had positioned herself between those two facts was now standing in front of us trying to explain why. And David took a slow breath before speaking again, his tone steady but firm. Where is the money now? And this time there was no attempt to soften the question, no room for explanation without accountability. And Victoria hesitated again, longer than before, her eyes shifting briefly toward the hallway, as if considering escape before returning to him. And in that moment, I understood something else, something that had nothing to do with the money itself. She had believed she could manage this indefinitely, that she could keep adjusting the story, keep moving the pieces until no one noticed the pattern. And now that the pattern had been seen, she did not know how to undo it. And when she finally answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It is invested," she said, and the word lingered in the air, vague and incomplete. And David's expression did not change, but something behind it did, something sharper, more focused, because that answer did not resolve anything. It only opened more questions, and I felt a quiet clarity settle over me once again as I listened, because whatever explanation followed would not erase what had already been revealed, and for the first time in a long while I was not trying to understand what had happened to me. I was watching someone else struggle to explain what they had done. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have, invested, as if saying it calmly could somehow make it reasonable, and I watched David process it in silence, not reacting right away, not raising his voice, just standing there with that same controlled stillness that had settled over him. And I recognized that look because I had seen it before when he was younger, when something did not make sense and he refused to accept an answer that did not hold together, and he finally spoke, slower this time, choosing each word carefully. "Invested where, Victoria?" And there was no accusation in his tone, just precision, the kind that does not allow room for vague answers. And Victoria shifted her weight slightly, her hands now clasped together as if holding them still might keep everything else from unraveling. And she said, "It is in a portfolio. I have been managing it, trying to grow it. I thought it would be better than letting it sit." And I felt a faint tightening in my chest as she said that. Not from anger, but from the quiet realization of how easily she had rewritten the story in her own mind, turning something taken into something improved, something justified. And I looked down at my hands for a moment, noticing how steady they were, how unaffected they seemed by the weight of what was being said, and I understood then that the shock had already passed for me. It had settled into something else, something clearer, and when I looked back up, David was still watching her, but now there was something different in his expression, something that had shifted from confusion into recognition, and he said, "You invested my mother's money without telling her," not as a question, but as a statement. And Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but paused again. And that pause was all the confirmation he needed, and I could see it in the way his shoulders straightened slightly, in the way his focus sharpened, and he continued, "In the house," he added, almost as an afterthought, but not really. "What about the house?" And for the first time that evening, Victoria did not answer immediately at all. She looked away completely, her gaze dropping toward the floor as if the answer might be written there somewhere. And the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before it, because this was no longer about a series of decisions that could be explained away as helpful or temporary. This was something else, something larger, and I felt that same clarity settle deeper inside me as I listened, because I understood now that this was not just about what had been taken from me. It was about how it had been taken, slowly, quietly, under the assumption that I would never notice. And I thought about the past 2 years again, not with confusion anymore, but with a new kind of awareness, seeing the patterns where I had once seen coincidence, the small ways my life had been guided without my knowledge. And I realized that while I had been adjusting to less, someone else had been deciding how much less I would have. And that realization did not bring anger the way I might have expected. It brought a kind of stillness, a sense of understanding that settled over everything else. And David spoke again, his voice steady but unmistakably firm. "I need the full account details, every transfer, every investment, everything." And there was no hesitation in his tone now, no uncertainty, just direction, and Victoria nodded slightly. Not because she agreed, but because she understood that there was no longer a way to avoid it. And as I watched them, I felt something shift inside me once more, something subtle but important. Because for the first time, I was not just seeing what had been done, I was seeing what would come next, and I understood that this moment was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something else entirely, something that would not be hidden or managed quietly. And I remained where I was, silent and still, not out of weakness, but because I knew now that I no longer needed to fight to be heard. The truth had already done that for me. Victoria did not argue after that, and that alone told me everything I needed to know, because if there had been a stronger explanation, she would have used it by now. Instead, she nodded again, slower this time, her composure no longer as polished as it had been when she first walked into the room, and David lowered his phone slightly, but did not put it away, as if he understood that whatever came next would still require proof, still require clarity, and the energy in the room shifted again, not explosive, not loud, but heavy in a way that made every movement feel deliberate. And I realized then that this was the moment where most people would raise their voices, where they would demand answers, where they would let the weight of betrayal turn into something visible, something undeniable. But I did none of those things. I remained exactly where I was, seated at the table I had prepared with such care, my hands resting calmly in my lap, because I understood something now that I had not understood before. Reacting would not change what had already happened, and it would not give me back the past 2 years. And David finally spoke again. This time not to Victoria, but to me, his voice quieter, almost uncertain in a way I had not heard from him in years. "Mom, why did you not tell me things were this difficult?" And for a moment I considered the question, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to choose the right way to say it. And I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just the man he had become, but the boy he used to be, the one who had trusted me to handle everything. And I said simply, "Because I thought you had already given what you could." And the words settled between us with a quiet finality, and I saw the impact of them in his expression, the realization that his effort had never reached me, that his intention had been redirected before it could become reality. And Victoria shifted slightly at that, her presence still in the room, but no longer at the center of it. And I continued, not raising my voice, not accusing, just stating what was now clear. I did not ask because I believed I was managing, and I believed that if you had wanted me to have more, you would have made sure I did. And there was no bitterness in my tone, only a calm acknowledgement of what I had believed to be true. And David exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as he stepped back slightly, creating a small distance between himself and Victoria. Not dramatic, not confrontational, but enough to show that something had shifted in his understanding. And I watched that movement carefully, because it mattered more than any words he could have said. And for a brief moment no one spoke, the silence returning, but now it felt different, not uncertain but resolved, as if the room itself had accepted what had been revealed. And I realized then that I did not need to press further. I did not need to demand restitution or explanation in that moment, because the truth had already done its work. It had changed the balance of everything. And as I looked at the table, at the dishes I had prepared, at the meal that had started as something warm and familiar and had turned into something else entirely, I felt a quiet clarity settle deeper inside me, because I understood now that the next steps would not be rushed, they would not be emotional, they would be deliberate, measured, and grounded in the same calm that had carried me through this moment. And I remained still, not because I was powerless, but because I knew now that I was no longer the one being left in the dark. No one moved right away after that, and the quiet that settled over the room felt different from before, not heavy with confusion, but steady with understanding, as if something invisible had finally been placed exactly where it belonged. And I could see it in David's posture, the way he no longer looked between us for answers, but instead stood with a stillness that came from having already found them. And he nodded once, not to Victoria but to himself, a small, controlled acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted. And when he spoke again his voice was calm, but there was a firmness in it that had not been there earlier. "I am going to pull every record, every transaction, every document connected to this, and we are going to correct it." And he did not look at Victoria when he said it, not out of anger, but out of decision, and she stood there for a moment as if she wanted to respond, as if she still believed there might be something she could say to reshape what had already taken form, but nothing came, and I realized then that the moment for explanation had passed, and what remained was only consequence, and I rose from my chair slowly, not because I needed to leave, but because I understood that my place in this conversation had changed, and I walked to the kitchen without hurry, without hesitation, and I began clearing the plates one by one, the same way I had done countless times before, my movements steady, familiar, and I could feel their eyes on me, not because I was doing anything remarkable, but because I was not reacting the way they expected, and that was the point, because I had already felt everything I needed to feel, and what remained now was clarity, and as I rinsed a plate under warm water, I realized something else, something that had been building quietly beneath everything we had just uncovered. I had spent 2 years believing I was living a smaller life, adjusting to less, accepting limitations that I thought were mine to carry, and now I understood that those limitations had been placed there, not by circumstance but by choice, and the difference between those two things changed everything. Because one can be endured, but the other can be addressed, and I turned off the water and set the plate aside, drying my hands carefully before walking back into the dining room. And when I looked at David, I did not see the confusion from earlier. I saw resolve. And when I looked at Victoria, I did not see control. I saw the absence of it. And I spoke then, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. I do not need explanations tonight. And both of them looked at me, surprised perhaps by how simple the statement was, and I continued. I need the truth, in full, and I will have it. And there was no anger in my voice, only certainty, the kind that does not need to be repeated, and I could feel the weight of those words settle into the space between us, because they were not a request, they were a direction, and David nodded again, this time toward me, a silent agreement, and Victoria did not respond at all, and I realized then that whatever had been hidden was no longer hidden, whatever had been controlled was no longer controlled, and whatever came next would not be shaped by quiet decisions made in the background. It would be shaped in the open, with every detail accounted for. And as I stood there in the center of the room, I understood something with complete clarity. They had believed I would never notice. They had believed I would accept what I was given without question, but what they never realized was that patience is not weakness, and silence is not ignorance. And sometimes the person who says the least is the one who sees the most. And now that I had seen it, there was no going back.